Good afternoon. I'm Andrzej Filinski, and this is joint work with Friis, Larsen and Thomas Jensen. So this project is about developing general principles for certifying safety and security of code so that we can execute it in a trusted environment. And as our modeling example, we're going to consider the Berkeley packet filter, where a user-supplied program gets to inspect, for example, all network packets while running inside the kernel, which then acts as the host. So before we continue, let's be a bit more precise about what we mean by safety versus security. So safety is about protecting the host or kernel itself against the code. So for example, the packet inspector should of course be able to read the packet, and it may also have some read-write space of its own, but it must not access anything else in the kernel address space. And then we want to ensure that as the code is executing, it never violates the safety policy, that is, accesses memory outside of bounds. There's a very nice framework for that, namely proof carrying code, which allows the code to be written in an unsafe language as long as it comes with a proof in what is essentially Hall logic that all of its memory accesses comply with the policy. And quite remarkably, any actually compliant program can then be proved to be so in Hall logic, and the only limit is that we may have to prove some complex formulas about integer arithmetic, but for memory safety, we're usually not even close to bumping into the incompleteness of, say, piano arithmetic. Security is somewhat different because here we're not protecting the host or the kernel itself, but we are granting the untrusted code access to some potentially sensitive data, and then we want to restrict what the code can do with the data. So for example, we may want to say that the code can only check whether some packet field is 0 or not 0. So it does get to look at all of the bits, but it's only allowed to OR them together. So it's not the act of any particular bit being inspected that's potentially a violation, but what we ultimately do with the information we get from inspecting the bits. And there are a number of dedicated systems for reasoning about this secure information flow, but often they only allow fairly coarse policies. So for example, we statically partition the state into high and low security, and then verify that no high security inputs can influence low security outputs. And secondly, those systems tend to be intentional. That is, whether some code is accepted may depend on how it's expressed and not only on what extension function it computes. So in our approach, we want to point out it's actually quite useful to consider safety and security together in the setting of partial equivalence relations rather than only unary predicates. So the general idea is that the P captures safety. That is, no safety violating states can occur at some point in the program as long as the initial state was safe. Right? On the other hand, the E captures security. That is, the remainder of the program will not reveal too much about the current state as long as we don't observe anything more about the final state than we are allowed to. So we specify what we are allowed to observe by saying when two states are related and therefore indistinguishable. So the simplest case is, well, we can observe everything about variable x. That is, we are allowed to behave differently depending on well, whenever the two instances of x are different. Whereas if we can only observe whether y is 0 or non-zero, well, then we can distinguish states in which the zeroness of y differs, but all the non-zero states are equivalent. And similarly, we can express as a relation that we can check whether the packet checksum is correct, but not reveal anything about the packet data itself. Or we can say that, if the packet has the evil bit set in the header, then we can inspect the full payload, but not otherwise. So we can express some fairly complex security policies, but how can we prove that the code complies with them? Well, first we note that usually safety critical code also is required to terminate, and quite quickly at that. So that means we don't have to worry about leaking information through termination status, but only need to consider the actual function that's being computed. And then safety and security assertions are basically just like partial correctness assertions in Hall logic, except that the pre and post conditions are pairs and not just unary predicates. And the program is semantically correct precisely when the function it computes is a pair morphism. That is, if a pair of input states are related by the precondition, then the corresponding output states must be related by the postcondition pair. So how do we then prove that the code satisfies such a property? Do we need some kind of special per Hall logic? Well, actually not, because we can take a per-based specification and then re-express it in plain Hall logic in terms of ghost variables. Right? Those are usually not used for safety-only proofs, but for security, we very much need them. So that is, we express what can be observed about the output as the post condition. Then we compute the weakest precondition corresponding to that to see what do we then need to be able to observe about the inputs. And if everything in the actual precondition is also in the computed weakest precondition, well, then the code is correct, and otherwise we reject it. And here again, crucially, we get to exploit that Hall logic, ordinary Hall logic is complete. So we know that there must exist suitable loop invariants for verifying all code that actually is secure. So all of the hard parts of this are actually required already for just safety-only proof carrying code. And in principle, we don't need anything more for certifying security. Although in practice, of course, we often get somewhat shorter and simpler proofs if we partially adapt the logic to deal with the pairs more directly instead of only through translation. So this is still very much work in progress, but we hope to present a more detailed technical account in the near future. Thank you.